Well, I am just delighted to be here with Patrick Deneen, who's professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, and I think one of the most thought-provoking and interesting political philosophers on the scene today. And his book "Why Liberalism Failed" some years ago made quite a splash and inspired lots of commentary, including from Barack Obama himself, who listed it as one of his favorite books of the year. More recently, "Regime Change" is his book, and we have a chance to talk about these two books and talk about political science and philosophy and all kinds of other themes. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Bishop. Thanks for having me. Since it's the start of baseball season, I just want to say how humbled I am to be here, and it feels to me like I've been called up from the minors, and now,
you're now in the majors.
Now in the majors, being here across the table from you.
Well, I do appreciate that. We'll see if we can play at a high level today. Well, listen, there's so much to talk about, and the books, as I say, are very thought-provoking and important books for the conversation. I thought maybe one way to get into it is to explore this kind of paradox that you observe, that liberalism is failing or has failed not because of opponents external to it, but because it's been true to its own principles, that there's something self-destructive about liberalism. Maybe we start with that. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, these are themes that are not, I know, not unfamiliar to you. You speak about these a lot. But the basic presupposition of liberalism, as I understand it, and I think as the tradition of political philosophy and theology would understand this, is that liberalism is ideally about the completely and truly free human being, the person, and freedom in the modern sense, freedom from any kind of obstacle or that which prevents us from achieving what it is we wish, what our will would desire. Of course, this is in contrast to the classical and the Christian understanding of liberty, as you know well. And that I would say, for much of American history, certainly for much of course, Western history, even if that modern view wasn't predominant, there was a kind of practice that came alongside its more ancient understanding. And those practices were basically practices we would think of as the sort of practices of virtue. In other words, the capacity to be self-limiting and learning to be self-limiting, which is, of course, very deeply in the Aristotelian tradition, very deeply in the Christian tradition. But when your definition of liberty becomes the freedom from or the freedom to do as one wishes, then those older practices and even institutions that taught us a kind of self-limitation, those now have to be either eliminated or changed, redefined, right? So that it's not that all the institutions go away. It's not that our Constitution goes away. It's not that institutions of politics or society go away. Like, for example, the schools don't go away, but their purpose changes, right? What it is they're engaged in doing. And the more we realize this modern notion of freedom in practice, the more, in a sense, we are left with the kind of realization, kind of the practical, political, social, economic realization of those commitments. And I think when we look at the large number of pathologies of the modern world, I think you can really trace them back to the realization of this theory of liberty. So this is all just to say that liberalism has failed because it succeeded. In other words, it took a long time. But when we think about the decay or the even destruction of all of the various institutions that you would think are necessary to a flourishing life, starting with the family all the way up to a political order, I think you can see the consequences of.
They're all in crisis in different ways, aren't they?
They all are. And I think there's a way in which many people who view these crises, it's a little bit like the blind men looking at the elephant. You tend to see it in sort of not connecting the dots. And I think if there was anything about my book that many people tell me, this first book, Why Liberalism Failed, many people tell me resonated with them, is it helped them to sort of connect the dots.
These are all kind of a function of a same set of assumptions that have produced this. We were talking before we started about Robert Sokolowski, who was one of my teachers at Catholic U many years ago. And I took his seminar in political philosophy, and I was just a kid at the time. But it was such an eye-opener because coming of age as an American, you take certain things for granted about politics and the purpose of government and all that. And then to read from the classical authors that the purpose of government really is to make us good, and it has something to do with virtue. And that freedom is not, as you're saying, simply doing what I want so I don't harm other people. There's one limit to it. But doing what I want, as opposed to, no, it's actually a kind of disciplining of your desire to make the achievement of virtue possible. But that was like a revolution in my own mind. Like, what do you mean that's the purpose of government? But for much of Western history, that was taken for granted until this shift occurred in early modernity.
So I think one of the things that's always, I hesitate to say this, but it's always a bit of a revelation to my students at Notre Dame. And this, you're talking about CUA, I assume, right? So even Catholic students, right, who grow up maybe going to Catholic schools, and going to church every week, perhaps, if not more often, even they have imbibed the dominant understanding of liberty. Even they, I'll often ask them, how do you understand, or how would you define liberty, or how would you define freedom? And they'll give me the kind of the almost Lockean definition of liberty, because it's the predominant view of the world that they imbibe more deeply than even maybe what they get in their formal education. Yeah. And then we do a dive in my classes from teaching Intro to Political Theory. We do a dive into thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, and I really emphasize, among other things, that take Plato as an example, in the Republic, when he gets to the description and discussion of what is the nature of the tyrant and what's the nature of tyranny, the tyrant appears to be the freest person in the world, because the tyrant can do whatever he or she wants. The tyrant is defined, in a sense, by the modern understanding of liberty. They can do as they wish. And then, in the course of describing what the tyrant is, he constantly, Plato, through Socrates, keeps describing him as a slave. Yeah. That the tyrant has the soul of a slave, because there is never a point in which the tyrant, in a sense, can ever fulfill the infinite desires that the human beings possess. And so the tyrant, in fact, is the least free human being.
And it's the problem that we've all become our own little tyrants. That there's not one tyrant. We're all a tyrant. Because, hey, look, it's my will. It's my desire. And as long as I don't harm you, but I've got the freedom to do whatever I want.
That's right.
And then you've got a society of little tyrants who have no sense of cohesion or of a real common good.
Well, of course, this is the understanding that lies at the heart of liberalism, which is, the title of the book is Why Liberalism Failed. And at base, I think the liberal sort of anthropology, right, the theory of human nature, is actually that we're all fundamentally tyrants. And
Hobbes.
And it's Hobbes. Right? This is Thomas Hobbes' understanding of human beings in the state of nature are tyrants. And the only way to restrain people from acting as tyrants is to impose from the top down this sort of external force, because it will not be internally gained. We can't develop the self-mastery. We don't have that capacity, right? In our heart of hearts, even if you and I might appear to be well-mannered, well-disciplined people, but in fact, put us, sort of Lord of the Flies, put us on the desert island,
we'll quickly
and our
devolve
tyranny
into
will,
the war of all
against
all.
Will manifest itself. So the only thing that keeps us from being little tyrants, the little Platonic tyrants, is this kind of imposition of the state that we all recognize we have to have. It's a kind of mutual non-aggression pact. But notice what this means is that what claims to be a philosophy of freedom is actually a philosophy in which ultimately, to keep us from acting freely, we have to have this kind of state that presumes there's no capacity to develop us as sort of virtuous human beings. We have to prevent the tyrant from sort of bursting forth. And so people are sometimes shocked and they sort of disappointed that, well, liberalism in theory is a philosophy of freedom, but we have such a big and oppressive government. Why is it that liberalism has developed this massive bureaucratic state? Well, it's built into it.
Yeah. It's protective, not directive, right? So classical political philosophy kind of directing people toward a moral end, where our sense is more, it's protective. So I've got rights, you've got rights, but we got to be protected from each other because we're a threat to each other.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's say with Hobbes, because I remember taking a seminar with Sokolowski and Thomas Hobbes, and something so fundamental shifted in Hobbes. And the wars of religion are often cited as a reason for that. But when Hobbes kind of blithely says in the Leviathan that, the old philosophers talked about the good, the summum bonum and all this, but there's none of that anymore. The good is just what I happen to desire, what you happen to desire. I mean, what happened? What happened to get from Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Hobbes? Wars of religion, I get it, that we just couldn't adjudicate our disputes, but put some more meat on those bones for me, because I wrestle with that. How do we get to Thomas Hobbes?
Well, of course, the kind of the Whiggish theory, right? The theory that the winners of those debates tell is that in order to resolve the wars on religion, we had to have some way of reaching resolution in which we would just basically, to use the philosophical term of art, we would bracket religious questions, or we would bracket questions of the good. Those would no longer be relevant,
and the
right?
good,
So there would be no more finis ultimus or summum bonum, because we can't agree. We can't agree on what that is. And therefore, those questions will be put aside, and we'll simply create a society in which we can have peace, and peace will be maintained by the sovereign, and people can pursue whatever they value, whatever they believe, as a private matter. So it's a kind of privatization of the good, right? It's the idea that whatever you think is the good, whatever I think is the good, that's privatized.
Right.
And in the public domain, it's just a kind of matter of peacekeeping.
Is that when Courtney Murray talks about the constitutional arrangement in our country as articles of peace?
Yeah.
So in a way, bracketing questions of ultimate good, although he certainly will invoke the natural law. Yeah. But at the same time, that stress is very Hobbesian, isn't it? They're articles of peace so we can kind of get along with each other.
Right. So the theory, at least, suggests that absent any agreement upon the good, you can have a society in which there's lots of kind of, you could say, this is in some ways the theory of pluralism, right? There's lots of little pockets in which people can pursue their idea of the good, and this would be religious pluralism. But Hobbes, I think, understands that what will come to predominate is a kind of what we would today call value relativism. And in fact, the language of values really comes from Hobbes. Hobbes, maybe Luther, there's maybe not as much distance between Luther and Hobbes as one might suspect.
Well, the anthropology has something in common.
It is. It is. It's fundamentally individualistic.
Right.
But the language of values is that there are only values. There's no truth.
Right. Yeah.
And Hobbes really stresses this. In fact, there's a chapter in which he talks about values, which in his view includes how we value human life. Right. Human life has no inherent dignity. It's simply what the market
will bear.
Will sort of how it will evaluate your life.
Yeah.
And if we think about our world today, well, what is our world? If your life is considered valuable, you get to live. And if you're no longer valuable, you either won't be born, or if you notice what's happening, of course, as you do, increasingly arguments that we should begin to evaluate the sort of usefulness of human life, particularly at the end of life. If you're no longer valuable to our society, then you should probably shuffle off the stage.
And who's making that judgment but the state?
Well, I mean, the state, but also the state reinforced by a value-free society.
Yeah.
So Hobbes really, it seems to me, reveals the way in which even in a supposedly neutral society, a kind of a predominant worldview will come to dominate. And you could say that predominant worldview is a kind of market way of seeing the world. It's one in which, because there are no objective values, everything is always being evaluated in terms of a kind of market calculation, which will ultimately devolve into, well, what will your society truly be devoted to? Mm-hmm. It won't be some objective idea of the good, but it will have certain things it will be devoted to. It will be utility. It will be materialism, right? Comfort,
right?
Wealth maximization, which is what allows you to be free,
right?
Is wealth maximization.
Because every society does, at least implicitly, have a summum bonum. So Paul Tillich, used to say that all you need to know about someone, you can find out by asking the question, what do you worship? Because everyone's got some highest ultimate concern, as he'd put it. Well, every society has got an ultimate concern. So you might say, oh, no, I'm bracketing all the questions of the good, but there really is a sense of the ultimate good, and you're displaying it there in a way, like so safety or for materialism or wealth become the ultimate goods of the society. So willy-nilly, it's there. It's not really bracketed. There is a kind of war between, competing visions of the good.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so of course, then not only, of course, now does this new understanding of freedom and what it values, what it regards as the highest good, not only does that come to predominate, but this worldview now becomes actively hostile to what we might think of as the kind of classical understanding and those who maintain the view of the classical understanding of liberty. And here's where I think, John Courtney Murray, writing in the post-World War II era,
50s,
was more sanguine about sort of the American situation, and I think maybe is warranted today, because it still seemed like you had a kind of civil society that still could bear, and bring to bear commitments to the good.
Yeah.
That leavened this more utilitarian, functionalist, materialist world. But I think when you look at, again, the logic of this, again, this Hobbesian, Lockean liberalism,
Right.
what it really will begin to do is both erode those values or those understandings of the good, and then turn hostile to them.
Yeah.
Right. Actively hostile toward them. Because what are they? They are now a kind of effort to impose some notion of the good, even if it's on their own pluralist population. It's still a form of oppression.
Yeah. And I know you're a student of Tocqueville, and many have commented that Tocqueville, in a way, noticed an equilibrium. So there's this liberal society at the upper level, but kind of underneath it is a common moral consensus born largely of religion that's providing a sort of ballast to the society. As that's eroded, as it clearly has in our time, I think in my own lifetime, the change in our society, visible change, from one that kind of basically held to, I'd call it a biblical anthropology, a biblical sense of life and the good, but that has eroded in the course of my lifetime. And then what are we left with when that Tocquevillian equilibrium is kind of undermined? Talk about that.
Yeah, so probably my own reading of Tocqueville is a bit more, again, a bit less, reads him in a less sanguine way.
Okay.
I do think that, again, a lot of the way in which Tocqueville was read and understood coming out of that same period in which John Courtney Murray is writing, and you have Richard John Newhouse developing arguments in First Things.
Right.
The basic view is the following, that there is this equilibrium, and if in a sense we lift the oppressiveness of the liberal state from civil society, that civil society will flourish. Right. So it's a kind of, it's almost a version of if you have laissez-faire in economics, you'll have prosperity. And if you have laissez-faire in the civil realm, you'll have kind of this flourishing of the civil sphere. I think that's been the dominant view of the kind of standard Republican Party for a long time. I think Tocqueville understands in a way that maybe a lot of his readers, that the corrosive elements of what he calls democracy, we might say liberal democracy, that these have a tendency and these have a trajectory. And that they need, in some ways, to be actively sort of not only resisted, but you need a kind of active way of shoring up those kinds of institutions. And he's careful about how he says this, but he talks about the need not just to allow associations, but to, in a sense, shore them up. He says there may be ways in which they have to be artificially created. And he also speaks of the need for statesmen and philosophers to shore up religion and religious institutions and a religious perspective. He says not directly necessarily, but he says by giving people a kind of long-term perspective, elongating their view of history or human life beyond their own generation, the kind of society that can build cathedrals over multiple generations. Liberal democratic societies are going to become, they're going to have a much more short-term view of things. The people are going to have very narrow understanding of time and temporality. And so to shore up a kind of a society that sees itself as engaged in a civilizational project, those leading the society need to be especially cognizant of how they give that sense of long-term, even eternity. And he says, through this, he said, there will be a long detour back to faith.
Yeah, okay. Suggests. No, and that's very interesting to me. And help me with this. Do you think the church's loss of confidence in itself, so let's say the generation before I came around, so my parents' generation, this sort of confident Catholicism of the 40s and 50s that inhabited the culture, I mean, with a certain swagger. I mean, certainly there was an anti-Catholic element. There always has been in America. But yet the Catholic ethos had a certain swagger to it, right? My experience coming of age, like in the 70s, 80s, then the scandals hit and all that. First, the church in more of a hand-wringing mode, of self-doubt, or coming hat in hand to the culture, please take us seriously. as I say, the scandals hitting, which then we lost more confidence. That's a societal crisis, not just a religious crisis, right? That the church has lost confidence in proposing a whole vision of life, proposing a way of life. And so that kind of the attenuation of the religious presence has been really bad for our society.
Yeah. Well, I think we're not that different in age, and so I grew up in a similar time. I mean, it's coming of age in the 70s and 80s, and I recognize what you're saying, but I also my experience of the faith growing up, and certainly growing up in a society in which there was a kind of I would describe myself as the generation after the generation that arrives in America. So my grandparents' generation, they're like the big immigrant. So I'm an Irish Catholic. Yeah. My grandparents' generation is the generation that comes here. My father's and mother's generation is the generation that's kind of living in this thick, right, what's called ghetto Catholic culture, right? Yeah. They grow up in that. And it seems really solid. It seems to be a very solid thing. And this is, I think, the point where it's enjoying especially what it takes as the generosity of American liberal society, right? You're able to build your own alternative institutions. You have your schools, your hospitals. My father went to Power Memorial High School with Lou Alcindor.
Right. Parishes flourishing, Catholic
parishes
hospitals
are booming,
and so on.
And things feel very good.
Yeah.
But I think, Catholicism it's certainly, you can say, we can look at times of human history where Catholicism was, in a sense, it's a kind of separate from society, in the catacombs, perhaps.
Yeah, right.
But the catacombs didn't have institutions. Mm-hmm. The catacombs wasn't, didn't have schools and hospitals and so forth. But the catacombs also wasn't where Catholicism was meant to stay, or even where those who lived in the catacombs wanted it to stay. It's a public order. I mean, it's not just a private order. It makes claims on the public sphere, on every dimension of life. And I think what seemed to be very strong at that time, when my parents' generation grew up, proved in fact to be very fragile.
Yeah, and I think that's fair.
And I can tell you that growing up in my generation, it seemed like it was almost, even before the scandals, it evaporated in my generation. There are very few of my classmates that I went to school with, high school with, who are still Catholic.
Right. Yeah,
And I dare say, even as a personal matter, I have 3 siblings, and none of them are practicing Catholics. So, if you're batting 25%, I think, again, to use the baseball analogy, you're not going to make the majors. So it turns out that having having a view of the faith in which we could have our own thing, not make any claims on the world, and in fact, at that time, start to enjoy the kind of blessings of the world.
Right.
As long as you conform, right? So the JFK, right? Go down to Houston and tell us the way that you'll be Catholic, but not really a Catholic president. It turns out that it's a much more fragile faith, which then, when the scandals come,
it fell apart.
It falls apart.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something fair about that. In a way, it's like the nostalgia for the pre-conciliar, church and all of its forms, but in fact, there wasn't a lot there when push came to shove. I'm reading right now that biography of JFK, and it's always illuminating, his faith, because he's a representative figure in a way. And then when I was a little further along in life, Mario Cuomo gives the famous speech at Notre Dame in 1984. Mm-hmm. And I've often remarked the declension from Mario Cuomo to Andrew Cuomo. So at least Mario at Notre Dame was, riven a bit, and I'm struggling between my personal and my public. And then by the time of his son's generation, it's let's light up buildings to celebrate, abortion.
So of course the Notre Dame speech, for those not aware of the speech, is he's considering a run for the presidency. He's largely viewed as the shoo-in, as the Democratic nominee. And he goes to Notre Dame to give a speech on abortion, which at this point the Democratic Party is still kind of struggling. Mm-hmm. It's shifting from, kind of had been, especially in the Northeast, the kind of Catholic Party. People like Joe Biden grow up under that dispensation. It's a pro-life party. It's a kind of socially conservative party. It's economically more liberal, socially more conservative. It's pretty Catholic in that sense. And but the party is shifting because the party has begun to move in a much more identity politics direction and the kind of sexual liberation direction that we now recognize. In that moment, Cuomo is kind of the key figure articulating, well, how can we, especially we Catholic Democrats, how can we articulate a kind of view that allows us to be, sort of pro-life, but now conform increasingly to the privatization of this view that people should be able to do as they wish. And his argument is that, well, I'm a Catholic, I'm pro-life, but that as a politician I have to conform to what the constitutional understanding of, at that time, post Roe versus Wade. So I have to conform to the constitutional understanding of abortion. Now, politicians all the time take stances in which they'll say, I disagree with the current understanding of, well, at that time, for example, gay marriage, right? So lots of politicians came out against the way in which court had decided that question. So it was a strategic decision for how to negotiate this, in which, and what you're pointing to, here you had a Catholic, the most prominent Catholic politician of his time saying, I will regard my faith in some ways as a private matter, right? And so it's almost the story solution. From Hobbes to Cuomo.
Yeah, which is fascinating, isn't it? Because JFK was certainly a bright man, but he wouldn't have been a careful student of political philosophy. But he represents that as sort of the last step in that process.
Well, but it's interesting though, because JFK doesn't go quite as far as Cuomo, because he says, and he has to go before he volunteers to go before the ministers down in the Baptists down in Houston, to have this long, it's amazing conversation he has, hours long, explaining how he will, how he can be trusted to become president in a country that has this historical mistrust of Catholics being hierarchical, really ultimately is taking their rules from the Vatican, and a fear that it would undermine the Constitution and its sort of autonomous condition. And Kennedy, in the midst of that discussion, says the following. He says, well, if there was ever a point in which my faith commitments and my conscience required me to act contrary to the Constitution, I would resign.
He'd resign, yeah.
So he didn't say I privatize my faith. He said, I'll resign. Now, whether he would have done that, maybe that's it.
But then from 1960 to 84, you have this further declension into, I'm privately opposed but publicly for.
And then the Andrew Cuomo declension is people should be able to do as they wish, because who's being harmed? In other words, we are now all the way to the Hobbesian, the logic of the Hobbesian understanding, which is that the liberty of the individual to do as they wish should predominate, but that needs to be contained then by the state. So the freer we become in our self-expression, the more you need the state to kind of stand, not only in terms of limiting our expressions of freedom where they become destructive of the society, but also actively advancing a vision of the free, unencumbered individual. Taking the side of, in other words, those who have the Hobbesian anthropology against those who don't. So the neutral liberal state goes away. And that's, to get back to the thesis of the book, this is where you get this paradox of the freest humanity imaginable also becomes the most subject. So we're back to Plato, right? You are back to the condition in some ways of, well, we're free and we're slaves.
Individualism and sort of a statism are not in opposition. They're kind of mutually implicative in the long run.
And I make that argument, of course, here I'm just sort of stealing from Tocqueville as well.
Yeah, no, but that's I think, a key point. Let's go back to the founding for a moment, because I've been involved in debates over the years about the American founding. And as you say, you've got certain people on the right, who'd be great advocates of the American founding, that it represents in some ways the best of even a biblical anthropology. You've got the insistence upon the Creator providing equality and giving us rights and so on and so forth. Others, very skeptical of the founding as basically a Hobbesian project, somewhat mitigated by Locke and by Jefferson. Give me a sense there, maybe if you were back there at the time as the American project is getting launched, what would you contribute to that conversation, or how would you assess it philosophically? Jefferson saying, for example, we have a right to pursue happiness, I've always found intriguing, because he doesn't define happiness at all. That's up to the individual. You have a right to pursue it as you see fit. Where the classical tradition is hyper interested in what happiness really is. Aquinas devotes, page upon page to beatitudo. What is it exactly? Plato is deeply interested in it. And then by the time you get to Jefferson, well, it's sort of undefined. Just you pursue it as you see fit. Talk about the founding a little bit.
Yeah.
How do you assess that?
Yeah, I always get into trouble when I talk about
I
the
do too,
founding
right?
because people think I'm
Right.
un-American. I'm not patriotic because I'm a critic of the founding, or at least
Yeah.
I would put it the following way: I'm a critic of what has certainly emerged as the dominant understanding of the founding period, and I don't want to confuse the dominant understanding, which is itself a kind of product of a certain history. And it's a product of the history, especially emerging out of the Cold War and the battle against communism, battle against fascism, which I would say didn't create ex nihilo, but read in a kind of exclusive way, or read out of that constitutional moment a particular strand of thinking, which was its kind of Lockean individualistic understanding, sort of the preeminence of human beings as right-bearing creatures, which in the context, again, of the Cold War and the fight against fascism, you can credit an extent to which that was a kind of politically necessary development, but which really narrowed the understanding of the founding beyond what I think its actual complexity reflects. So in criticizing the founding, I recognize I'm kind of criticizing the way in which the founding has been interpreted by, for political reasons and strategic reasons, but it's not that it's not there. It was certainly there, and it's there in some of the most preeminent of the thinkers. I think it's there certainly in Jefferson, although Jefferson was complex, the Declaration especially. I think it's there in Madison's understanding of the Constitution, in which the Constitution is really designed as a document or as arranging a regime that will sort of create articles of peace and will sort of put to the side questions of the good because society already seemed too complex, and the assumption was that kind of predominant liberal understanding of the political order. What interests me, though, is that there were voices at the time of the founding, and they weren't Catholic voices. They were predominantly Congregationalist voices, so coming out of the Reformed tradition, who were quite critical of this dominant view. They viewed the Constitution or some of its assumptions as too privatistic, as not sufficiently attending to the development of virtue, as neglecting some shared understanding of the good. One of the critics of the Constitution says there's no provision for sort of national academies that would promote virtue. These get to be known, this basket of people get to be known as the anti-federalists.
Right.
And there has been some scholarly interest in them over the years, but I think they've, like many of the losers in these debates, they tend to get written out of the story. And I often like to, both assign those texts to my students and point out this is a legitimate part of the American tradition, right? This is our tradition. We don't have to sort of say as Catholics, these weren't Catholic authors, but they were drawing on a tradition that you could say goes all the way back to the classics. They were drawing on an older tradition, even though they were hostile to Catholics in many cases. They nevertheless still spoke that biblical vocabulary that we're talking about. And in that kind of, again, that Congregationalist tradition, even Puritan tradition that Tocqueville regards as the kind of true founding of America, there's a way in which you can read that tradition as giving us a kind of vocabulary. And when Catholics arrive, this is what the bishops are seeing. So Bishop Hughes, Cardinal Hughes, I guess at that point. This is what John Courtney Murray is writing about. This is what Orestes Brownson, buried in the crypt at Notre Dame, right? And what they all say to a person is that the official founding of America is flawed because it's based on these Enlightenment, Hobbesian, Lockean principles. But there's a deeper kind of sub-constitution.
And not a privatized thing where like we just discussed that among ourselves, but really a public form.
And they all use the phrase, America was founded, the founders built better than they knew. They built better than they knew. They were appealing, or kind of there was implicitly a kind of a widespread understanding that kind of served as a sub-basement to what was otherwise a kind of flawed philosophy of a number of our founding fathers. And I think one can say that when Catholics come to America, and they rightly see this as a land of freedom that can allow them to worship, and when the 1950s you get this emergence of Father Sheen, and you get the public culture, which you get the Song of Bernadette,
and Going My Way, and the confident Catholicism
the
of the
Boys'
time.
Town. You get this, you get this public, and you have movies like the Ten Commandments winning the Academy Awards. There's every reason to think that public dimension of the faith has a place at the table.
It's very interesting because we could recover it to some degree. See, at times I get the sense of despair, like, look, the toothpaste out of the tube. There's no way we're ever going to recover the pre-Hobbesian sense of the good. We religious people talk about it, but come on, publicly in our country. And so the best we can do is this kind of Articles of Peace approach. And, so I'm always looking for signs of hope that we could recover, not aggressively, not violently and all that, but recover a common sense of the moral and intellectual. It's an epistemic crisis too, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was a loss of confidence in our capacity to know the truth. What's the path to recovering that? And you're hinting at it there, both with this at the time of the founding and coming up through the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
What's the ground for hope today that we could recover it?
I think the ground for hope, actually, I guess it's in the title of this book, which, Bishop, I'm the last person in the world who expected this book to do well. This is published with Yale University Press.
Yeah.
I was, I thought maybe I would get it published and get promoted to full professor, which I did, so I got that. It sold 60, 70,000 copies, which by academic standards is pretty good.
Yeah.
And it touched a nerve, as you already mentioned, across the political spectrum. So it's sold not only among people of a more conservative, traditional disposition like myself, it's sold among people on the left, because it really took both sides of our political order to task. And it took it to task for reasons I think that would be familiar to a Catholic, which is that each side has this kind of liberal, libertarian dimension that is leading to this kind of societal self-destruction, whether on the right as a kind of form of free market
They're
orthodoxy.
two sides of the same liberal coin, you'd argue,
Exactly.
but we call liberals and conservatives.
Right.
And
then the left, especially with its kind of sexual libertarianism, that has, I think, in many ways undermined the family and kind of the core basis of a flourishing human society. And people could pick up this book on any part of the political spectrum and find something that they agreed with, although in many cases they would say, I agree with half of this book, which is what Barack Obama did as well.
Yeah, right.
Well, there was half of this I like.
Right.
But in a sense, what that indicates to me is that everyone recognizes there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And more people are beginning to put together, well, you're not going to solve this on the terms of the current political dispensation. So if there's grounds for hope, at least for me, and as a Catholic there always are, but at least in the narrower political sense, it's that the people who are reading this book and getting most excited about it are young. They're young people.
Yeah.
They're students. They're people of the generation after us, who they're not buying the goods that their older generation has been selling them, that the only way that conservatives can fight against this is by reviving the fusionism of the Reagan era, or the left is, at least some element of the left is seeing that the kind of lack of concern about formation of families and homes and so forth is really a problem. So I think that there's hope. Now it's a qualified hope, because this is I would say, a thoughtful minority of people, but I think it's what could be the beginning of a kind of fundamental change. It'll take a generation, but in which a recognition of the perils of the logic of liberalism is increasingly recognized, and a kind of alternative is developed.
Mm-hmm. Let me stay with that for a second, because you look at the stats around young people today, and the spiking numbers, depression and anxiety, suicidal tendencies, and very often we run to the social media, and I think they play a role, to be sure, in all that. But see, I've often wondered if it's this deeper thing. In some ways, the whole new atheism fad is like a limit case of what we're talking about. it's all up to me. I decide value. I decide what's true and good. There is no objective norm. We don't come from anywhere. There's no objective moral value. I have no moral purpose to my life. And a lot of people, young people, heard that message from the new atheists and said, "Oh, great, stick it to religion." But look what you're left with. I mean, it's this blasted landscape of hopelessness. And in a way, that is the limit case of what we've been talking about. Is when you so internalize and subjectivize value, and you've lost any common ground. That together we can work for a good that lies beyond us, that we both believe in. Or our whole society can be ordered according to goods that we all believe in. When that disappears, of course you're left with depression, anxiety, and so on. And so in a way, I see that paradoxically as a sign of hope that people hit a wall and will say, this is just not working.
Yeah, I think if it turned out that the condition of the sort of complete liberation of the individual, as we've been describing, as sort of liberalism posits as a kind of, that's what our true nature is. If it turned out that people were immensely happy, joyous, they thought life was never better, that it was fulfilling and profoundly satisfying, then I think we might have to, we Catholics and sort of more Aristotelians say, okay, turns out empirically we were wrong. We were wrong, we can keep our faith, but, maybe.
But in fact,
it turns out maybe we had the wrong theory. I think in many ways, none of us are surprised by seeing, all of the kind of measures of social science. And this is where I think social science actually can be valuable. I'm a little bit of a skeptic of my own discipline, but social science seems to me consistently showing that on every measure of human relationality, the ways in which we form or don't form bonds, everything from, bowling leagues and Robert Putnam's description, down to the level of friendships. Like how many close friends do you have? And that number's been declining.
Fewer and fewer young people.
Right? And if you don't have good friends in your life, that you can call up at 3 a.m., like, give me a ride home from the bar.
You'll be morally lost pretty quickly. Aristotle knew that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So in every measure, those aspects of our life are declining, and so are measures of human happiness and satisfaction. And again, I think one only needs to read Hobbes to know that this, of course, is going to be the outcome, because Hobbes doesn't describe the pursuit of happiness as leading to happiness that's defined as a kind of individual pursuit of satisfaction that can never be fulfilled. He doesn't describe this as the condition of happiness itself. He says, how does he describe the human being? The human being, is kind of egged on by desire after desire that ceaseth only in death. That's what human life is in his understanding. And this is why there's no summum bonum and no finis ultimus, because, of course, Aristotle, and Thomas as well, argues that human happiness is an achievable condition, at least in the form that it can be achieved in this world, which is that condition of genuine liberty. The condition of having been educated and raised both in one's private, social, and political lives to be a person of virtue.
Freedom from attachment and sin, freedom for the achievement of the good and all that.
That's right. So that happiness, it's not just the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
It's happiness.
It's happiness.
That's the finis ultimus.
Right. And it's, again, intriguing to me. For a long time, the brightest people in our society thought, we could know that. You would come to know that. And then almost everyone today would say, oh, no, I can't possibly know that. And who are you to be imposing your view on me? Can I shift gears a little bit?
Sure.
I can talk to you all day. This question of safety, especially young people today are obsessed with safety, safe spaces, and don't harm me, and keeping me safe. And I was intrigued by your suggestion. I forget which book of yours it's in.
This regime change.
About Mill. And someone who is very influential on the liberal point of view today. But that stress on, look, you're free to do whatever you want, but the limit is, doing harm to people. Talk about that a little bit, what that means to do harm to somebody. Why did that become such a criterion, for the determination of liberty? Talk about Mill and harm a little bit.
We already mentioned that. I think Mill is already in Hobbes, and at least in the following sense, that that human liberty, and this is now Mill's real effort to develop liberalism from the kind of Hobbesian Lockean trajectory to something that I think we would recognize much more so today, which is the argument that there should be as much liberty as possible so long as your exercise of your liberty doesn't cause harm to someone else.
Right.
And this is, I think, this would be, if you were to ask any,
They'd
just
take that
about
for
any
granted.
person,
It's like a
especially
basic
person,
principle. Yeah.
that's what their definition of liberty.
Yeah.
It might take a couple sentences to get there, but
Yeah.
they would say, well, you should be able to do what you want unless you're harming someone else.
Right.
This is always the arguments against any kind of morals legislation or restriction on our freedom. Who's being harmed, right?
Yeah.
How, prove to me some measurable harm. And so that there's as soon as you adopt that as the dominant understanding of how you organize your society, it's more or less guaranteed that everything short of that which causes physical harm.
So physical harm, really.
Yeah, it becomes you can no longer legislate on those kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. But there's a really interesting sort of, you could say there's an interesting codicil in Mill's argument, which is that Mill is not just pushing liberty for the sake of liberty. This is, I think, the misreading of Mill by libertarians in particular. Mill is arguing that liberty is really a means to a further end, and that the end we want to achieve is a kind of idea of humanity as a progressive being. This is how he describes utility. Utility isn't merely the Hobbesian utilitarian understanding. Utility is defined in its widest sense, he says, which is a creature that's progressive in its nature. And by progressive here he means constantly pushing the boundaries of what's permissible in human society. This is part of his reason for arguing for free speech and free expression, is that even if liberalism as a political matter has sort of constrained political power, you still have the power of public opinion, sort of people judging me.
Right.
And this is what he really wants to push against, so that liberty is really the expression of the transgressive, right? The radical, right? What he calls individuality, and that this is the liberty that especially has to be preserved. So in understanding liberty in this way, well, now it turns out that we can start to measure harm as that which limits my expression of this kind of radical individuality, which means now, once I begin to define harm as, well, if you want to judge me, if you're judging my individuality, that's now a kind of harm toward me. That's creating a judgment about me. And now we can exercise authority over that, because if I can prove harm, that's subject now to some kind of limitation, public, social, what
now we're into wokeism.
And that's really, I think, so I know you had Chris Rufo on. I like Chris, but I think Chris is really working hard, and others in the sort of conservative movement, to sort of say wokeism arises from this kind of foreign contagion. It's cultural Marxism. Right? It comes from Marcuse. It comes from Marxism. Except, guess who the figure that Marcuse invokes most often in his book, in his essay, which is the argument for intolerance. Repressive tolerance is the title of it. This is the kind of you could say it's the playbook for what we think of as wokeism. The people who are on the right side of the political spectrum should be repressed because they are trying to instantiate intolerance. So we need to be intolerant toward the intolerant. The figure he cites most often is John Stuart Mill.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, he cites John Stuart Mill because John Stuart Mill, in a sense, defines where it is you can begin to invoke limitations. And the limitations have to be on those who want to limit the transgressive. So again, notice how, in a way that is in keeping with the anthropology of Hobbes, in its own way, that the transgressive, the individual, the genuinely free, has to be given a kind of put into the driver's seat. And there's a through line from Hobbes to Mill to Marcuse. So Marcuse doesn't represent just a foreign contagion of Marxism. It's within the liberal tradition. And so for those who just want to say we need to just go back to John Stuart Mill to save us from Marcuse.
We're going to get back to Marcuse through that. It's very interesting. I think the people are writing around the same time, Mill, Marx, Newman, right around the same time. And Newman, who's
Orestes Brownson.
And Brownson as well. And Newman, who in many ways reverences the modern tradition, takes it in, Locke especially, but then has the fathers in him and has the Bible in him, which gives him a whole different sense of what liberty. And then someone like Brownson on our side of the Atlantic.
It's interesting, too, that Brownson and Newman are both converts to the church. They see something. and they recognize the dangers within American and British society. But of course, the church at the time. I've been doing a course right now on liberalism and its critics, and we've been reading a bunch of 19th century sort of encyclicals and authors, Brownson among them. Now figures that the church, or at least let's say dominant voices in the church, want to say, okay, we don't resort to those arguments anymore. Post-Vatican II, we've made our peace with modernity, we've made our peace with liberal democracy. And I think there's it's interesting to go back and read some of those figures, Bonald and Below and Cortez and some of these 19th century reactionaries or counter-reformation, counter-revolutionaries, because they all discern obviously the dangers of liberalism as they understood it, and again as it's played out. They predict, okay, this is going to come after the family, this is going to come after the church, right? Anything that's not fundamentally anthropologically individualistic at its core won't be tolerated. It will be actively attacked and
that has
disassembled.
come true.
So I think looking at what happens from the 19th into the 20th century, again, the church always says it's reading the signs of the time and rendering a kind of its judgment of how to express the faith, which is consistent and true over time, how to express the faith in light of the signs of the time. If you think of the signs of the times in the 1950s, 1960s, Vatican II, and so forth, you're coming out of fascism, you're coming out of communism, and the church is opposing both of these things. And it says, okay, if we look at the landscape right now, liberal democracy looks like this might be a workable political order for us. This is something we can work with. There's enough here. If you're reading the signs of the times right now, it seems to me the church needs to really begin thinking about how do we express, a certain, kind of ongoing willingness to be skeptical to those aspects of the world. It's always going to, right, the world will be against us. Those aspects of the world that the church will always be in the position to have to correct. And I think we might be coming into that time. And I think Pope Francis, in his own way, has been someone really understanding this and working toward this. He doesn't come out of, he does come out a bit out of that world, but in a way that John Paul II did not, who, living in Poland, living under the thumb of the Soviet Union. I think there's a way in which the church is beginning to see that communism and fascism are always going to be antithetical, but there's a way in which the regime that we thought would be friendly to Catholicism is going to have to be subject to some probing examinations and critiques.
And we should always be in that stance. We've lived through so many different cultural forms and political forms, and the church has said yay and nay to all of them. Certain elements are good. And so the same kind of critical distance we have to maintain vis-a-vis the present system. Something I've always been intrigued by is go back to the 19th century, and there are voices in America, not just bigots, not just simple-minded, bigoted people, but thoughtful people who looked at the emerging Catholicism in America and said, "Wait a minute, that's not our thing. That's antipathetic to America." And when I was coming of age, like, oh, those people back there, they were so anti-Catholic. Well, in a way, weren't they right? And in perceiving the Catholic vision is different from the Hobbesian, Lockean, Jeffersonian vision of liberalism. It's a different worldview. They have a different relationship to nature and to culture and all of that. Yeah. They weren't entirely wrong, in other words, in being wary of this new Catholic vision of life.
I think that's right. I mean, I think those critiques were right, and of course they go all the way back to the foundation of liberalism, which was founded as explicitly as anti-Catholic. Right. Hobbes is clear about this. Locke is clear about it.
Locke is pretty clear about it.
Locke says, we'll tolerate any religion except, we won't tolerate atheists because we can't trust them. Yeah. And we won't tolerate Catholics because they pay feasance to a foreign potentate. They believe that the Pope, it transcends any secular order or what the Pope represents. So at the very roots of liberalism is a kind of anti-Catholicism. And those figures, from the time of the founding and into the 19th century and even into the 20th century, I would say even today, right? Whenever I'm described by the popular media, Catholic political theorist Patrick Deneen at the University of Notre Dame, because I'm an enemy. So there's no political theorist that I can think of on the left who's described Protestant political theorists or Jewish political theorists. It's always Catholic political.
So they're getting something. They're getting something that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. But they want to make sure that I'm labeled so that you automatically know I'm a bad guy.
You're a bad guy.
So I think it's true. And the obverse of this is the way in which Catholics, of course, we've already mentioned this, but Catholics, in order to kind of gain acceptance in this world that was otherwise, this country that was otherwise hostile to them, had to trim. And JFK is a good example of this, and Mario Cuomo is a good example of this. But frankly, I think the mainstream of Catholicism has had to trim. They've trimmed either by conforming themselves to the political left, so you get the left Catholics. They've conformed by conforming themselves to the political right, and so you get the right Catholics. But it turns out the right Catholics and the left Catholics tend to at least be tolerant, if not downright supportive of the libertarian elements of the political left in its sexual domain,
and then the economic,
or the economic in terms of the right, and not only just tolerant, but even in some cases, I point to the right in particular, actively promoting a libertarian economic
and that's
policy.
certainly not Catholic social teaching with regard to the economy. I think of John Paul II, favoring the market economy. Indeed, the Church has been suspicious of socialism from Leo XIII on, but a market economy circumscribed legally and morally in all kinds of ways. So it's not like a just liberal libertarianism.
Supporting labor unions and
So again, escaping the easy left-right divide. Yeah. But it's a minefield, isn't it, as Catholics have tried to make their way. But I wonder, as I said earlier, that a loss of confidence in our own great intellectual tradition and not sort of begging for space within the liberal arena, but, proposing a whole different vision of life.
So this is when I mentioned the younger generation. So it is a cause for hope for me, but I'll say qualified hope in the following sense, that I think especially the younger generation of Catholics, I spend a lot of time on college campuses, my own campus, Notre Dame, a lot of other campuses, and the younger generation of those who would consider themselves to be really Orthodox Catholics, they're what we're talking about, they're there. They really see themselves as, and now this term that I've somewhat adopted, it's the subtitle of the regime change book, post-liberal, which has its roots and origins in post-liberal theology. Right. But post-liberal is becoming fashionable as a way of describing this because it sees itself as sort of succeeding liberalism, sort of rejecting liberalism to court in the ways we've been describing this as kind of trying to refashion a kind of more Aristotelian understanding for the modern age. So it's not pretending to go back. It's post-liberal. It recognizes where we are now. So I would say the younger generation of Catholics have to be among the most intellectually vibrant and engaged, maybe of Catholics of any time. I mean, can you think of a time in which sort of what you might think of as the average Catholic, was reading Aquinas and Augustine and the most
the younger,
all the
seminarians.
Like I didn't know any, I didn't know the encyclicals growing up. And I grew up in that sort of still quasi ghetto world in which we weren't taught encyclicals, much less Aquinas or Augustine. We read some version of the Baltimore Catechism. Know how to answer these questions. These are intellectually really engaged young people. So on the one hand, I think they're actually well armed in a way that maybe the generations that we came out of weren't. I do worry, though, that the faith could potentially move in too intellectual direction because, of course, it's a faith of practice and piety and practice, and not just for a kind of elite. It was the faith of ordinary people. And that's where I worry about the church increasingly. It's sort of its intellectual dimension. Like young college students who are engaged, I get invited all over the place, as I'm sure you do, to talk to these kinds of students. Right. But it's the average person who's not in touch with these sort of currents, who's working in the trades or working a service industry job, and how is the faith going to be alive for them? And that, of course, that's so much of what you're trying to do, I know.
Do you think, I mean, someone like Dorothy Day comes to mind, someone who combines, an intellectual dimension, but also this deep, moral commitment, and also sharing a deep suspicion of the standard, culture for time. And I don't know,
Well, this is where in the second book, the latter book, Regime Change, I think a lot about, I'm trying to think a lot about the relationship of elites and the mass in this, not the Catholic mass, but the masses in this book. And here this is an effort to revive a kind of, again, an Aristotelian tradition of the idea of the mixed constitution, which in Aristotle's understanding, which I think is correct, as is so often the case, Aristotle understands that every society is in a way riven between some kind of relatively small number of people, the elite, and the large mass of people, and that there's a kind of natural antipathy between the two. And he says this often, not always, but often is defined by a difference of wealth. This tends to be the dividing line. And it just so happens that it's built into the nature of things that the few tend to have the most money and the many have less money, they're less wealthy. And that every society will tend to devolve into some kind of a civil war or anarchy as a result. And what will prevent this from happening is the big question. And as I'm reading and teaching Aristotle over the years, and as sort of the rise of populism and concern about elitism is kind of just in the air, I'm thinking, why aren't we talking more about Aristotle? Because he's describing exactly our circumstance. And what Aristotle proposes as at least one of the answers to this permanent condition of humanity is a kind of not hostile, but a kind of cooperative and even friendly relationship between the few and the many, which he calls polity, which is a word that means constitution. In other words, the idea of somehow mixing the elements. And in thinking about what he means by mixed constitution, what I truly try to explore is what would that mean for us today? And at the deepest level, having taught at Princeton, Georgetown, and Notre Dame, I think the contemporary elites coming out of institutions like mine mix very little with ordinary people. I think there's, in a way that maybe not to be nostalgic. Yeah, I mean, the kind of deplorables. That's the most, I would say,
extreme,
the most execrable and extreme form of that. But there's also a kind of non-prejudiced form of that, which is just not having any contact.
Living in different worlds.
Living in a kind of bubble. This is what Charles Murray describes in his book Coming Apart. Just living entirely, going from upper middle class to upper class suburbs to the best schools, to Notre Dame, to living with your graduate friends in Brooklyn, and then going to live in wealthy suburbs and retiring in Florida. Never really living
Never
with
mixing with the other world.
And so, and this does touch on the question of the faith, because we were saying earlier, well, what can a bishop do to really change things? Of course, I'd like to think that people like you are doing a lot. But it seems to me in a Christian society, it's not going to be just the church. It's going to be the people in society who are, those who people admire, right? The people we want to be like, those we want to emulate. And when those people are, coming out of Hollywood and so forth, and they're kind of garnering all of the attention, that's going to have a certain kind of tenor or flavor to society. But even the students I'm describing who are very intellectually engaged and smart, most of them are going to live in D.C. and New York City, and they're going to take jobs at McKinsey and work for Senator so-and-so and clerk for the Supreme Court and go to law school. So it's not an antipathy to ordinary people. It's just the path that we're on today. And one can say, and I'm a fan of Wendell Berry, one can say, okay, read some Wendell Berry, read some Rod Dreher, and choose the Benedict option, choose to kind of live in a place that's not in the kind of the elite places of society. But at some level, it's also structural. It's structural. And it may need a more structural way of addressing this, right? And what would that look like? Well, I think going back to Catholic social teaching, there's a real suspicion of sort of economic concentration of power. There's suspicion of some degree of political concentration. But
it's one of the great underappreciated elements of it, I think. It's just that. It doesn't like concentrations of economic or political power. It likes it distributed.
That's right.
Hence Chesterton's distributism.
That's right. And so we clearly today we certainly have concentration of political power. We recognize that. But we also have concentration of economic power.
Yeah.
And this is where I think the kind of conundrum comes into play, which is in the Catholic understanding, I think broadly, you're going to need an exercise of political power to sort of limit the economic concentration of power. So there is the appropriate exercise of political power, which isn't just centralized political power, but it's the ways in which I think so much of our economic system today is all about absorbing the people who are graduating from the institutions where I teach and taking them out of, removing them from all of the various places of our country where they could really valuably be these kinds of more local stewards of their society and could become the admired people of their places. And I say this as someone who really thinks that short of that, I don't know how the ordinary person working the service job or the trade job necessarily finds their way to the faith in a way that doesn't require them to do, an advanced course of study today.
Yeah. I think I have a couple of things. I probably have to close. I got to talk to you all day again, but we're a little past time. But years ago, when Sokolowski was teaching us Aristotle, that line, what's the right thing to do? And the answer is find the good man and do what he does. Yeah. And it's one of those things you can say, well, it's a circular answer, but I think there's something very right about that. It's not so much learned abstractly through principles. It's, well, there's the good man. And especially if you're in a smaller community, it's easy enough to pick out, oh, yeah, that's the good man that I want to, whatever he or she does, that's what I want to do. In the more religious context, it would be the saint. Who's the saint in our community? What do the saints do? Well, that's what I want to do. And I wonder if that's a way to recover this great tradition. It's not just a theoretical, as you suggest, but it's these embodied figures, the good man, the good woman, the saint, will teach us, what the good is.
Yeah, since I'm in Minnesota right now, I always like to mention to my students, I say, well, many of you want to go off and you will go off and work for, again, you'll be a functionary in the regime in Washington, D.C., and you'll have a good life, and it'll be interesting. You'll meet lots of interesting people, and you'll be surrounded by nice restaurants and so forth. But you will be, you may have some impact. You may help draw up some legislation, but you'll have relatively modest impact in terms of the world around you. I said, but think about someone like Moonlight Graham, who was in Chisholm, Minnesota. Right,
Field of Dreams.
If you know the movie Field of Dreams, right? This was he was the local doctor. He was a real figure. He was a real human being. And
Burt Lancaster from the movie.
He played by Burt Lancaster. And I love baseball, as you can tell. I've referenced it several times, and I just wanted to learn more about him. So I've spent some time reading about him. And he's someone who every community in America has had people like this.
Yeah.
I grew up in a town, Windsor, Connecticut. We had people like this. Every town.
The good man that people would.
Yeah, the good man, exactly, who was a kind of figure of enormous prestige and prominence in that relatively small place. He was the doctor.